If you have a Samsung S95F QD OLED from 2025 and you're looking for a complete settings walkthrough, this is the video for you. I'm going to go through every adjustment for SDR and HDR night and day, and game, especially game PC. So there's a lot to go through here. It's going to take a little over half an hour, and I'm going to start with the initial startup screen. So when you first get the TV, you unbox it. If you don't know, you don't have to sign up for anything. You don't have to use the smart features. And in fact, I would recommend doing it this way. You can just skip through all this process. You just keep clicking to the right, click skip, click next. But other than that, you can get through it very quickly. And then from this main smart hub, you can see it's very stripped down. There's not a lot here. We can go to our HDMI connected devices. I always recommend using an HDMI device, especially like for streaming, because with a Fire Stick, Cube, or an Apple TV, something like that, you can match frame rate, not have to be stuck with 60 Hertz like you do with the built-in apps. Also, I don't recommend updating the firmware on any TV unless there's a particular feature that you specifically want from it. So starting here in SDR, it's going to put you into eco mode. We're going to change that and go down to Filmmaker. And then from Filmmaker, we're going to go back a couple steps and go down to General and Privacy. And we can go to the Powered Energy Saving and turn off Brightness Optimization. You can also check here to see that everything else is kind of off by default. If you were to do this step in a different picture mode, then when you switch to Filmmaker, it would still be on. So you want to make sure you do that in Filmmaker. Now we're going to scroll down to the Panel Care and then the Pixel Shift and Adjust Logo Brightness. These are up to you, but they are kind of more distracting than they are useful, so I would suggest turning them off. If you need to do a full pixel refresh, if you have any image retention that's not going away, this is where you'll find it. So now we're going to go back and we're going to go down to Support, and this is where you're going to find what firmware the TV is on, if there's an update available, and then you can decide if you want to or need to update for any particular reason. Again, I would advise against it unless there's something in an update that you actually want. Now if we go back to advanced features, this is where the game mode settings are and start screen option. We'll come back to game later, but for now go to start screen and we're going to disable the two toggles here that are on or any others that might be on for you. That way whenever you use an HDMI device, it'll just go straight to the last used input on the TV. Now for sound, if you're using a receiver or a sound bar and you need eARC support, you'll go to expert settings and you need to turn on eARC mode. Otherwise, if you want to adjust speaker settings, how it sounds and so on, you can do that as well. So the HDMI device I'm using, I'm sitting at the menu screen. It's the Fire Cube and it's in SDR currently. So you have to make sure you're playing the type of content that you want to adjust. So SDR content for adjusting SDR, HDR content for adjusting HDR. Now for SDR, 100 nits is the standard. So for the S95F, setting brightness to 9, and then you also want to turn down the contrast a little bit to 38 to stop any clipping. That should be right about 100 nits. If you want more, if you need more for your room, feel free to turn it up a little bit to whatever is comfortable. As we go down, you don't really need to change anything else. There's an HDR remastering toggle that is not going to be accurate, so we're not going to use that here. Peak brightness off, contrast enhancer definitely off. Now shadow detail, it's really going to depend, one, on your particular panel, and two, on your viewing environment and room. If you have a lamp or something, you might want to put this on 2. If you have a really dark room, maybe 1. Just set it to whichever works better for your room or your environment, unless, better yet, getting the TV calibrated, which we'll talk about more in this video. Going through the rest of these settings, you really don't need to change anything else. Now, if you do like motion interpolation or any other motion settings, you need to go to the picture clarity menu, and then you want to go to custom. Then you have blur reduction and judder reduction. So blur reduction is going to be your higher frame rate content like sports, and judder reduction is going to be lower rate content like movies and TV shows. So if you don't like panning judder in movies, then you would increase the judder reduction. If you want your sports to be smoother, you can set the blur reduction higher. The judder reduction one is going to implement soap opera effect when used though, and then clear motion is black frame insertion that most people won't like to use because of the flickering and the cut in brightness. Noise reduction settings is going to be up to you depending on your source. So if you have a crappy looking cable box or something, you might want to play with those settings and see if you like it. Otherwise, I would just recommend leaving it off and really that whole menu off if you're sensitive to soap opera effect. Now there are white balance and CMS settings and other things that should only be done with a meter and a full calibration. Color Booster Pro though, if you like oversaturated colors, you can try that out on low or high. It's not accurate, I don't recommend using it, but it's there if you like it. Color space should remain in auto for SDR content, which means it stays in BT709. If you are going to adjust the CMS, then you would have to change it to custom, but you would still see that it says 709, which is the standard for SDR. So at this point, we now have a night mode SDR set up, and just do one quick scroll through here of the settings, back up to the brightness. Like I said earlier, if your room has lights in it, or if you just don't like 100 nits, you can increase the brightness slider. Increasing the peak brightness is going to increase the ABL of the panel, so I would start with increasing the brightness slider to wherever you need it, and then if you're in a really bright room, when we get to the bright room mode, then that's where if the slider isn't enough for you, then you would go to peak brightness, but it's better to have peak brightness off and just adjust the brightness slider. So now we're done with filmmaker mode. So now we're going to go into, I would use movie, which is identical to filmmaker mode if you were to set all the settings the same. But what we're going to do is set movie up for daytime. So we're going to increase the brightness slider higher. Now I find that a lot of people like around 300 nits for a bright room. So that would be around 45 on the slider for brightness with the contrast at 38. And then everything else here is going to be pretty much the same as what we did for filmmaker mode. One thing that we'll do different is the shadow detail setting won't need to be turned up as much in the brighter mode because we are pushing the brightness so much higher. So you might be able to leave it at 0 or maybe just put it at 1 instead of 2 if you used 2 for filmmaker earlier. Also, if you do have a very, very bright room, you can increase the BT1886 slider or change the gamma to 2.2. And then again, with the peak brightness setting, if you have a completely sun-soaked room with floor to ceiling windows and whatnot, tons of light, then kind of just set those brightness settings to where you need them to be comfortable when viewing. And again, this is for SDR. With HDR, we'll deal with that in a few minutes when we get there. Clarity settings are going to be the same thing as we talked about earlier. So if you want the motion smoothing on, then you would enable it, go to custom, and set mostly the Judder setting wherever you like it. Now I'm going to switch over to the Apple TV just to show settings that I would use for an Apple TV, which is one of the more commonly recommended streaming boxes. And then I'm going to use it to start up a YouTube HDR video just to put the TV into HDR mode. And we're going to change the picture mode back to filmmaker. Now when switching between SDR and HDR, whatever picture mode you were in for one is the picture mode you'll be in for the other. So if you want a day and night mode, you'll just change it and it will stay the same for SDR and HDR. So now we're in HDR and we're in filmmaker. The brightness and contrast both need to stay at 50. The sharpness setting we'll talk about a little bit in a minute. And then the color, we're going to preemptively turn it down to 20. You'll see why in a few minutes. The HDR tone mapping for filmmaker, to be accurate, should be in static. Peak brightness should be on high for HDR. Contrast enhancer off still. Shadow detail, same kind of situation as earlier. You might need to increase it depending on the lighting in your room. Maybe put it at 1. Don't think you'll really need 2 for HDR. Moving on down to the color space settings or color gamut. So in auto, even though it says DCI P3, it's actually using BT2020. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change it to custom, I'm going to change it to BT2020. Pay attention to some of the colors of the tones of the image as it switches, and you'll see like the buildings here in this image is a little more blue in 2020 than it is in P3. And so when it's on auto, even if it says P3, it'll be in BT2020. Now, one of the issues with the S95F this year is a decrease in color luminance when using the BT2020 compared to last year. So now what we're going to do is I want to show you that the other gamut option in here that is considerable is the normal setting. We really don't want to use native. And if you see where it says DCI-P3, when I change it to 2020, it's going to change normal. There's actually two different normal gamuts. So normal will react differently depending if it says that it's in P3 or if it says that it's in 2020. So that one is not like auto. So if you change it straight from auto to normal, you're actually going to be stuck in the P3 version of normal, which doesn't have the full 90% of BT 2020 that QD OLED has. So you want to go down to custom, change it to BT 2020, then switch it to normal. Now, moving on from there, you can see here how the Color Booster Pro has much more effect now in HDR than it did in SDR. But again, this is not something for accuracy, and I would recommend leaving it off. So while the white point out of the box on the previous Samsung QD OLEDs was usually more magenta, lately I'm seeing them now be a little too yellow. So I don't really recommend doing this, but if you do think your image is a little too yellow, you can increase the blue gain just a few clicks. But really the best way to do it is to have it calibrated to know for sure, and also then the color can be better calibrated, because while the normal with the color setting turned down to 20 will help and make it better than it is out of the box, it still would be better to have it calibrated and know for sure that you can get the most out of your TV, especially if you happen to be able to get one of the few people who know how to calibrate these with the service menu. There's a lot more that can be done there. So now we're going to move back over to movie mode, and again now we are still in HDR. So we can see that the brightness and contrast is still at 50 where it should be. And then here's where I'm just going to show, if you turn up sharpness, it doesn't actually make the image sharper. It makes it where there's ringing and artifacts in the image, especially after about 4 or 5, it really becomes noticeable. But if you find that you like setting it a little bit, say 2, 3, you don't really notice the artifacts and it just has a more perceived sharpness effect, then you're not going to hurt anything. You can set it wherever you like, but I do know some people like it around 3. Color you still put at 20 here, and now the other change is we're going to do HDR tone mapping on active, which is not accurate, but it's going to over brighten the image, which is going to make it more visible in a brighter room. Now the contrast enhancer, again, I really don't recommend using. It can cause a lot of clipping and crushing and other issues. If you really need to adjust the luminance a little bit more, you have the shadow detail on ST2084 settings. So if you find that it's over brightening too much, you can turn these down a click or two. If you still need more brightness for your room, you can try increasing them a click, maybe 2. But otherwise, we're going to go down to color space settings, and again, we're going to go to custom first, and then change it to BT 2020. And then go back up and change it to normal so that it'll say normal BT 2020. And then the Color Booster Pro, again, that's up to you, but I wouldn't personally use it. And then we have the picture clarity settings, which we have already gone over a couple times before. So again, set it to your taste and your preference. And then that's going to be it for the modes that are watching. Now we're going to move on to the game settings, which is going to take quite a bit more time. So if you're not really interested in the game mode settings, or you don't game, you can go ahead and get ready to click off. Thank you for watching up to this point. And if you are interested in getting a real calibration on the display, I do cover the right half pretty much of the United States. You can send me an email at classytechcalibrations@gmail.com to inquire about getting calibration work. Alright, now moving on to the game mode, I'm going to start with the Xbox. So you can see here everything is checked except for Dolby, which is kind of obvious. This is the settings that I would use on the Xbox itself. Before we move into the actual game settings on the TV. Now, again, this is after a fresh reset of the TV, so everything you see is going to be how you would see it if you just opened it up and were just setting it up. So initially the game mode isn't even turned on, so I had to go in and set it. You can either set it to on if you want to force it on that input, or set it to auto. if you're using a receiver like I am. So we're actually going to start with HDR using the HDR calibration menu in the Xbox. Now you'll notice that the image is pretty blue and whatnot, so we have quite a bit of changes to make, and there's multiple game menus which can make this confusing. The first thing you want to do is go back to that game mode settings menu, and we're going to go down to Game Picture Expert. There's also Game Motion Plus settings, which we will talk about later, and it's grayed out right now, and I'll show you how to ungray it later. The dynamic black equalizer is not going to darken anything, it can only brighten, so for the most part you won't really use it. So under the Game Picture Expert, there's HDR10 Plus Gaming and Game HDR. We want to have Game HDR set to basic. HDR10 Plus is only going to affect or matter if you're on PC. It does nothing else. It doesn't really matter if that's on off or basic if you don't have PC with an NVIDIA graphics card. So now that we have the Game HDR Basic turned on, which is the most important part of getting HGIG, we can go to the expert settings. We see the brightness default is 27, which is odd. The sharpness setting will default to 10. You'll want to turn that down to 0. And we see HDR tone mapping is on static, and that is correct. That's what we want, again, for HGIG. Peak brightness should be on high, contrast enhancers off, everything else pretty much where it should be, except for the color settings, which we will get to as well. So we're going to change the color space out of native, and we're going to mimic what we did earlier, where we're going to go to custom, put it in BT 2020, and then change custom to normal. And then we're going to go back to the regular color setting higher up in the menu and reduce that from 25 to 20. And then we're going to talk about the brightness and at 27 and contrast at 50 and what's going on here. So previously on the S95D the year before, that brightness was default to 40, and prior to that it would default to 50. Now the brightness and contrast both play a role in the EOTF tracking and the clipping point. So with the way that it's set up originally, it's going to have a clipping point of 2000, but the EOTF tracking is wrong. So now we're going to increase the brightness, which is going to increase EOTF tracking. So if you go all the way to 50, now the EOTF is over tracking, meaning everything is over brightened from what it should be through the mid-range. So then if you reduce to contrast, it's going to raise the clipping point, but you're not going to be able to get it to where it's tracking EOTF and clipping at around 2200 nits where it should be with the brightness at 50. So what you're going to want to do is decrease the brightness to 40, the same as last year, and then put the contrast to 48. So that's where the EOTF will track the closest to what it should be, and the clipping point will be at 2200 nits. Now if the brightness is at 40 and the contrast is at 50, it'll clip at 2000 with a bit of an overtrack in the EOTF, which is probably where Samsung normally would have it based on their history. But if you want it to be more accurate and better than that, I would set it to brightness 40, contrast 48, with a clipping point of 2200, and then your EOTF tracking should be pretty close to what would be accurate. Now with a calibration using the service menu, you can actually set it where you can have both of these set to 50, and the clipping point would be even higher. I have it at 2300 on mine, and the EOTF tracking is pretty much perfect. Alright, so now I'm going to load up a game in SDR. I'm going to hold down the play pause button to bring up the game bar menu. Now it's going to default in standard. We want to change that genre down to original. So now when we go to the settings, they're going to be different. And now that we're in SDR, original is going to be what you want to use for SDR, but not HDR. And I'll show a demonstration of that in a bit. But for SDR with original, we're going to turn the brightness up to 50 and reduce the contrast to 38. It's going to be very similar to like the movie mode SDR settings. This is for 300 nits in SDR. The HDR remastering has a very slight effect here, but it's not very noticeable. and not really something that I would use or recommend. We decrease the peak brightness to off. Again, this will put it to right about 300 nits. For the shadow detail in game mode, near black is a little bit different than it is outside of game mode, so you probably don't need to use it, but if your room's brighter, you might want to go +1. Other than that, that's really all you have to do for the original game preset. Now, back on the Xbox settings, if I were to change it to 60 Hz, and then also you would have to disable VRR, that's how you can get the Game Motion Plus to unlock or stop being grayed out. Game Motion Plus is going to be motion interpolation for games, and it does have a slight but still somewhat increase in input lag, but most find that it's not noticeable. So if you set it in this menu in the game bar to level 1, what it's going to do is turn it on, but have the blur and judder reductions at 0. Clear motion, again, that's the black frame insertion, which for gaming, a lot of people actually do kind of like to use. So, try it out. But if you go to level 2 on the game bar, then the Game Motion Plus settings will increase to 10 and 10, which is going to be the most amount of added smoothness, but the higher amount of input lag, which is still not that high overall, and most people, again, don't notice it. For me, it kind of depends on the game. For the most part, I never really use Game Motion Plus. Personally, I find the reduction in motion persistence or the visual smoothness doesn't quite match the feel, and so the games can feel sluggish because there's also a increase in input lag in the game engine or throughout the end-to-end latency when playing at 30 FPS. So if you're playing with really high latency through end-to-end, but the game looks like it's running at 60, to me it's just kind of off-putting, and I'm not really a fan. And especially on the Xbox, I like to use the 120 Hz option so that it uses frame doubling, which does reduce the input lag even more by using the display at 120 Hz. So it's up to you. It's there if you want to try it. Now over on the PS5 Pro or PS5, the settings are going to be the same as they were on the Xbox when it comes to the TV. I'm just showing here where I put the brightness and contrast back to the defaults and how it matched what I saw on the Xbox. And again, what we're going to want to do is have the brightness at 40 and the contrast at 48. And then the PlayStation doesn't really have a 2200 nit option, so you're going to want to go with where you turn it all the way down darker until you can't go any darker, and then you're going to count each click upwards until you get to 21, which is in the PlayStation 2300 nits, which is going to cause it to clip. There's no way to get to 2200, and setting it to 220 would be 2000 nits, which is what it would be if you left it at the default 27 brightness, but then it would undertrack UTF, so you're not going to want to do that. And if you left the contrast at the default 50, then that would be 2000, which is 20 clicks. So again, we don't really want to do that. We want to do 40 brightness, 48 contrast, and then count up 21 clicks for both of the white screens. And then on the black screen, just go all the way down so it's fully black. Looking here at the rest of the settings on the PlayStation, pretty much just match the same, where it's mostly all automatic. For the HDR, I recommend putting on when supported, so that it doesn't convert your SDR games to HDR. And then I also wanted to check to test 1440p. The S95F doesn't seem to support it. That is going to be a slight concern for the Nintendo Switch 2 coming up, since 1440p 120 Hz will be the best option for it most likely. Here I'm just showing after I did the service menu calibration, I'm able to put the brightness and contrast up to 50 and increase the clipping point in HGIG to 2300. So as of the time of this video, the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion remake just came out, and it is SDR only. It does not support HDR natively, and so people on PC are going to use RTX HDR, things like that, to try and make it into HDR. this TV, does have some settings. So if you were to say increase the contrast, turn on HDR remastering, increase peak brightness, color booster, things like that, so on. There's going to be people who are trying this. So this is what it looks like with those all turned up versus using the SDR settings that we've already gone through. So you can decide if that's for you. Not really something I would use or recommend, but again, some people are going to try stuff like that. Now I want to show why not to use the original game preset in HDR, and also a quick little demonstration that turning off the HDR10 Plus gaming is not going to do anything on console, and there's no measurable difference, there's no visual difference, it doesn't do anything. So with the game HDR basic turned off, and if that way you can get into the original game preset, one, it's going to match any of the settings that you've already set for SDR, so we have to undo that. So I did that, and now I can toggle between off and basic, and you can see the huge decrease in brightness by using the original preset. Now, the original preset is generally used because you can get more accurate color closer to Filmmaker, but that's if you're using the auto or real BT2020 preset. So just use game basic, because using original, the TV is always going to think that it's 10,000 nit tone mapping, which is going to cause it to drastically undertrack the OTF, and all your highlights will just basically be dead. Okay, now we're going to move over to PC. That's going to be the final thing that we need to show and go through. So when first connecting the display as a monitor, we're going to, everything's just going to be way too big, so we need to change the scaling. I'm fine using 100%, but set it to whatever is visually comfortable for you to look at. And using just the Windows tool, the 165 Hertz is already there. Nothing has to be done, no settings to turn on. It's just there and it just works. And the game bar is going to pop up. It's going to be an auto. So this is a new input, a different input. All game settings are per input. So if you have different game systems or PC or whatever, different inputs, you're going to have to do all the settings again on the other input. All right, so now game HDR is off because Windows isn't in HDR by default. So I have to go turn on Windows HDR to get there. But first I'm going through the SDR settings, and you can see that it's in auto. We need to change that to original in order to have our more accurate settings. And then it's going to be the same SDR original game settings that we used earlier for the Xbox, the PlayStation, and those would also apply to the Switch as well. All right, now the TV settings for SDR on PC is done. I'm going to go on the PC and Windows and turn on HDR. So after it turns on HDR, we're going to need to also set up the HDR calibration on Windows, as well as change the settings on the TV. I did check real quick to just make sure that it's in 10-bit, it's RGB, full range, just general PC stuff that I would use. If you see the flickering right now, that is not the TV or anything. That is a mismatch between the shutter speed of the camera and now that the TV is operating at 165 Hertz. So now by searching for HDR in the search bar, I can get to the HDR calibration tool on Windows, and it's going to be just like it was on the Xbox and the PlayStation, where you set up the HDR to what the HDRG is set to, so 2200 nits using the settings that we're using. And we need to change the settings on the TV again, so we need to go down to game mode settings, go to the game expert, and then go to game HDR, turn that on basic. Now, because I am using an NVIDIA card, an RTX 5080, I'm going to leave the HDR10 Plus on basic as well, and we will set up HDR10 Plus, as it also is another mode that needs to be set up. So, have our brightness at 40 and contrast at 48, turn the sharpness down to 0, and so on. Been through this a few times now, so I'm not going to verbally repeat it all. But I will remind that we need to change color to custom, to PT 2020, to normal, go back up to color, change it to 20, so on. Okay, so once you do all that, now you have SDR and HDR set up. You can see this is what the HDR tool looks like on Windows. Sometimes the bar will disappear as you're adjusting it. If that happens, just close out and redo it, or you can just kind of hope that you're clicking on the right spot and eventually you'll find it, and then it'll like kind of pop back in. It's Windows, it's buggy, it happens. From there, I'm going to also load up a game that supports HDR10 Plus to put the TV into HDR10 Plus mode. So I'll show all that here in just a moment. I am going to also pop open the NVIDIA control panel, where you can also see the same settings as what we have already done using the Windows display settings. But I'm going to go to G-Sync and just click the little toggle box to enable G-Sync on this display. It doesn't officially technically support it out of the box, so clicking that box doesn't really matter, but it's just something that I would do. Okay, so now going over to Cyberpunk and turning on the HDR mode to PQ then allows the HDR10 Plus to be enabled. So apply that, bring up the game bar, and it now says HDR10 Plus Gaming on the bottom of the game bar. You also see on the game bar it says 165 FPS. Now go into the settings, and you can see the settings are all just default. This is after I had made my server's menu corrections, so I forgot to show you, but you would want to still use 40 brightness, 48 contrast, and just set all the settings the same as we did for the game HDR basic setup. Now, a bug that I did encounter is after being in HDR10 Plus Gaming, and then I went to another game that does not support HDR10 Plus, it was stuck in HDR10 Plus. So you can see the game HDR section was grayed out, and it was just in HDR10 Plus. Turning off HDR on Windows, turning it back on, that did not help. That did not kick it out of it, essentially. The way to fix it was to go back in the Game Expert menu and turn off HDR10 Plus Gaming, and then it would re-trigger to where you could turn Game HDR back on Basic, and then turn HDR10 Plus Gaming back on Basic. Then I went back into a regular HDR10 game, and it was fine. And then I went over to Call of Duty, which is also HDR10 Plus, and it switched there. So if you experience that issue, just turn off 10 Plus on the TV, and then turn it back to Basic and turn Game HDR back to Basic. So other than that, that's it. That's fully set up. That's pretty much everything I can think of. Again, I still would recommend getting the full calibration if you can, just to really get the best out of the display. So thank you all for watching. I hope this helps you out. Let me know down in the comments if you have any extra tips to add, especially on the PC side for people, and I will catch you all in the next one. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.